Hello guys, this is something I've been wanting to make for some time. I've spent the last several months reading into ancient documents, searching for as much detail as I can get on the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. I want to present this video to you regarding my findings, because I know that many have come to believe that Christianity was made up centuries later with no evidence for a Jesus figure in actual human history. So, I've spent the last several months vetting several ancient documents to see if we have any historical evidence for the claims of Christianity, specifically regarding the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Before we start, however, I'm going to clarify that these sources that I'm presenting today are not the only sources that I found. I found many other sources, but I have three main credentials for the sources I'm presenting today. 1. They cannot be Christian sources, so no text in the Bible or no writings of Eusebius or Papias or Origen or anything like that are going to count. 2. The authors of these texts must have lived within 100 years of the time of Jesus. And 3. We need to have the original text. Now, what do I mean by original text? I do not mean original documents, and I've got some sample documents here to explain what I mean. This here is the original document. It says, "My mother and I went to the store." In 4 out of 5 of these sources, as far as I know, we do not have this original document. So I'm putting that on the side. We don't have that. What we do have are these copies of the original document. Some copies, such as this, that say, "My mother and I went to the store." Exact word-for-word copy of the original document. Some copies might look more like this. It says, "My mom and I went to the store." So there's a slight difference between "my mother and I" and "my mom and I." Same meaning, but with different words. Alternatively, we might have other copies that say something more like this. "Yesterday, my mother and I went to the store." So still talking about my mother and I going to the store, but there's an added detail, yesterday. Or we might have clarifying details in some of these copies, such as, "My mom and I went to the grocery store." The word groceries is added to explain what kind of store it is, adding details that might be lost in the original. And a final type of variation we might have in some of these documents would be like this. "I went to the store with my mother and father." Notice this one adds an entirely new figure, father. Added detail entirely. So in one of these sources, we do have the original document. In the other 4, we've got copies of the original document, but we do not have the original document itself. And they still count. Now, what does not count in this list is documents that the consensus is not there of when this person lived, or let alone wrote, such as Mar Bar Serapion, although it's a great text, would not be included, or the Jewish Talmuds, though they have some fascinating insights on Jesus, they will not be included. Other sources like Celsus, Thales, and Phlegon will also not be included in this video. Although they are fascinating texts in their own right, we do not have any surviving copies of the original text. All we've got is Christians quoting them, and so we've got fragments of their texts. But it's Christian sources that are quoting them, so they're not included. So what we've got left are 5 documents that are non-Christian. The author lived within 100 years of Jesus' life, and we've got, if not the original document, full copies of the original document. I'm going to be presenting these sources in likely historical order. So first on my list is a famous Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, who lived from about 37 to 100 AD. He was a military leader in the Jewish-Roman wars until he had a fight with a specific general whom he supposedly had a vision of would become the next Caesar. Now, sources conflict on the details of this, but Josephus ended up in the service of this general, and 2 years later he did end up becoming the Caesar, and so the Caesar allowed Josephus many freedoms, such as writing an extensive history on the Jews. The main bulk of Josephus's works is a 20-book series called The Antiquities of the Jews, which just basically goes over the entire history of the Jewish people. He also wrote a 6-book novel called The War of the Jews that specifically covers the wars of the Jews. Now remember that Jesus is a Jewish figure, so one should expect him to appear in Josephus' writings, and in fact, he does. In his 18th book of Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes in verse 63 through 64, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he had appeared to them again, alive again, the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." So, let's investigate this text. Note that my first credential of these sources is that they are not Christian. And yet, this first source is claiming that Jesus is A, the Christ, B, risen from the dead, C, a wise man who did wonderful works, and D, questionable over his humanity versus deity. If Josephus claimed these things, then it's hard to say he was not a Christian. Now, many have suggested that this passage was added by later Christians. Now, most scholars reject this notion in its entirety. They do, for the most part, however, agree that there was something here in Josephus' writings about Jesus, but it was most likely embellished by later Christians. Texts like the following have been proposed as more likely. "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise or cunning man, for he was the doer of wonderful or controversial works. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." Now we have taken out the deity claim, the Christ claim, the resurrection claim, and we've changed the understanding of wise man to cunning man and wonderful works to controversial works. But it is possible that we can reason some of these other elements back in. First off, the quote, "if it be lawful to call him a man," may have been original because it was controversial in the first century whether Jesus was a man or God. And Josephus could have been alluding to this controversy, not proclaiming his divinity. Second, the phrase, "he was the Christ," may have actually been reasonable as a distinguishing mark. For the Jews do not see the word Christ as significant. They acknowledge Jesus as the Christ in the sense that Christ is a title and not a position. But it is not the Jews confessing Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. For a Jew, the term Christ and Messiah are two completely different concepts. Even though Christ is the Greek translation of the Jewish Messiah, they mean two different things for the Jews. Christ is just a term, so it's possible that Josephus would have identified Jesus as a Christ to distinguish which Jesus this is, because the name Yeshua, or Jesus, is a very popular Jewish name. Now, Josephus had a little bit more to say about Jesus. In his 20th book of the Jewish Antiquities, he is recording a political ploy by the high priest Ananus at a time when Caesar Festus just recently died and the governor of Judea, Albinus, is away. He says in verse 200, "When therefore Ananus was at this disposition, he thought he now had a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, and some others, and when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." Now, of course, this mention isn't really about Jesus, although it does again confirm that Jesus is known as the Christ. But rather, this passage is about Jesus' brother James and the account of his execution. James, identified in Christian literature as James the Just, James the brother of Jesus, or James the brother of the Lord, was, according to tradition, the first pastor of the church in Jerusalem after his brother's death. And when he was martyred, Jesus and James's younger brother Josephus became the second pastor of the church of Jerusalem until he was also martyred. Their yet younger brother Jude is also believed to be the author of the book of Jude at the end of the New Testament. These things are more Christian tradition and don't have as much historical backing as the rest of this, though. In total, Jesus had 4 brothers that are accounted in Scripture. James, Joseph, Jude, and Simon. Jesus also had some sisters, and these relatives are mentioned in Matthew 12, 46 through 50, Matthew 13, 55 through 56, Mark 3, 31 through 35, Mark 6, 3, Luke 8, 19 through 21, John 2, 12, and John 7, 5, 1 Corinthians 9, 5, and Galatians 1, 18 through 19. Now, the significance of James's death here is that it implied that he was killed for his faith in his brother Jesus. It is worth mentioning that the above passage, John 7:5, mentions that Jesus' brothers did not believe in him during his lifetime, and yet after his crucifixion, his brothers came to believe that he was the risen Christ. I'm not sure what happened to Simon, but we do see James, Joseph, and Jude as all being followers of Jesus after his resurrection. Now, we don't have historical confirmation of the fate of Joseph or Jude, or even their existence. But this account of Josephus does confirm James's death at the hand of the Sanhedrin, and the method used is reminiscent of the method used of somebody who had enticed Israel to worship of someone or something other than God, such as Jesus in the eyes of the Sanhedrin. My second source is often considered the greatest and most critical scholar from antiquities, a Roman historian named Cornelius Tacitus, who lived from 56 to 120. Tacitus recounts the fire of Rome, from which the legend "Nero fiddled while Rome burned" originated. Tacitus recounts how a large fire broke out in the city, and many of the citizens began to believe a conspiracy that Nero himself caused it maliciously. Tacitus doesn't weigh in whether Nero did in fact cause the fire or not, but he does account how Nero passed the blame from himself to Christians. I'll put the full text on the screen, but I will only be reading a shorter version of the account. He says in the Annals book, 1544, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, which is Latin for Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." From this account, we can conclude that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, exactly as the Bible describes it. Not much more is given on this account, other than the followers of this Christ figure were called Christians, and they believed in this mischievous superstition. Furthermore, this mischievous superstition seems to be a cover phrase for the resurrection, as we will see something similar to it later on. It basically is a term fake news in our modern eyes. Lastly, it is important to note that Christianity began in Judea, where the events in question actually happened. Now, which would be easier, spreading a miraculous claim that hundreds or thousands of people had witnessed in the region where it supposedly happened? Or spreading a miraculous claim that hundreds or thousands of people had witnessed in a foreign land? If you think the latter is more likely, that's exactly the point. Tacitus is telling us that this miraculous claim that hundreds of people had witnessed, the belief in it started in the region where the witnesses would have been. The fact that Christianity began in Judea shows that it wasn't some hearsay spreading in a far-off land. There are some forms of legitimacy to this crucifixion and probably a missing body. Now, I included a larger portion of the text, and do that to encourage the reading of the text in its context. But I want to address something specific about that I noticed. Tacitus is not a fan of Christianity. Note how he doesn't say that Christians actually committed the crime by causing the fire. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty, and that pleaded guilty was of Christianity, not of causing the fire. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. So see, he's saying that their trial was ultimately about their Christianity, not about firing the city. Despite possibly being innocent, Tacitus doesn't really say either way, but despite their possible innocence, Tacitus still accounts their torturous deaths. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flame and burnt to serve as nightly illuminations when daylight had expired. These are terrible deaths, but notice at the end of these passages that Tacitus still doesn't have much sympathy for the Christians, but rather calls them criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment. Not for starting the fire, but for believing this mischievous superstition. My third source is a Turkish man named Pliny the Younger, who lived from about 61 to 117. Pliny was a governor in a Turkish area when he faced trials regarding this growing Christian population, and thus wrote a letter to Trajan Caesar verifying methods for handling this rising threat of Christianity. He tells Trajan his method of examining Christians and sentencing them to death, and other things, upon his investigation. He found certain things out about their beliefs, first in a section when he had people who recanted their Christianity to save themselves. He writes, "However, they assured me that their main of their fault or their mistake was this, that they were gathered on a stated day to meet together before it was light, and to sing a hymn to Christ as to a God, alternately, and to oblige themselves by sacrament not to do anything that was ill, but that they would commit no theft, no pilfering, or adultery, and that they would not break their promises, or deny what was disposited to them when it was required back again. After which it was their custom to depart and to meet again at a common but innocent meal, which they had left off until the edict, which I published at your first command, and wherein I forbidden any such conventicles." So, from this interrogation, from these people who ended up recanting their faith, Pliny said that these Christians claimed to gather once a week to worship Jesus through song, that they would make an oath together to live in certain moral principles, such as not stealing, not committing adultery, keeping their promises, and giving back to people what was entrusted them. But Pliny also interrogated some people who did not recant, and this is what he has to say from what he gathered from them. "These examinations made me think it necessary to inquire by torture what the truth was, which I did of 2 servant maids who were called deaconesses, but still discovered no more than that they were addicted to a bad and an extravagant superstition." There's that term again, extravagant superstition. What is Pliny talking about? He's talking about the resurrection, same as Tacitus when he referred to his mischievous superstition. Immediately after this, Pliny says that he stopped the investigation to write to Trajan to inquire what to do. Now, there are many fascinating things in this letter. It's not particularly long, so the link will be included for you to go read it. First, it shows that there was persecution in the early church. But was this just a one-time thing? No. At the beginning of the letter, Pliny talks about him being aware of other trials regarding Christians in other provinces, but that he wasn't familiar with the finer methods of the trials. He writes, "I have never been present at the examination of Christians, on which account I am unacquainted with what uses to be inquired into, and what and how far they used to be punished. Nor are my doubts small, whether tender youths ought to have the same punishment as strong men, whether there not be room for pardon upon repentance, or whether it may not be an advantage to one who had been a Christian but had forsaken Christianity. Whether the bare name, without any crime besides the crime adhering to the name, be enough for punishment." In other words, he wants to know specifics about the standard trials for Christians. 1. Whether children should get equal punishment as mature adults. 2. Whether people get pardoned if they recant. 3. If somebody had a past affiliation with Christianity, should that be brought up against them? 4. Rather, they needed crimes alongside their Christian beliefs in order to be justified in being put to death. Now, why this is significant is because some skeptics have also suggested that Christians were never given the opportunity to recant their faith, thus never really proving their faith. Pliny also blatantly rejects this, but rather gives them 3 chances to recant. He writes, I asked them whether they were Christians or not. If they confessed that they were Christians, I would ask them again, and a third time, intermixing threatening with the questions. If they persevered in their confession, I ordered them to be executed. Overall, Pliny's letter and Trajan's response is worth a read, and these sources are included in the links below. Trajan does also respond, mostly applauding Pliny's work, although he does discourage him from actively seeking out Christians for trial. My fourth source is Roman historian Suetonius, who lived from about 69 to 122. This is a very brief mention in his book, The Lives of 12 Caesars. He writes in the section about Tiberius in chapter 25, verse 527, Suetonius writes, Tiberius, he banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Cressus. This passage is controversial for two reasons. 1. Tiberius expelled the Jews, not just the Christians. 2. The account is regarding somebody identified as Crestus, not Christus, which is the Latin for Christ. First, let's tackle the Jewish-Christian controversy. It is important to note that Christianity stemmed from Judaism. It is a Jewish religion. Too many people have forgotten that throughout human history. It is reasonable to think that a foreign source may have lumped Christians and Jews together into one category because of not understanding the differences. Plus, it would be easier to banish an ethnicity like Jews rather than a belief like Christianity. Okay, second problem about the name Cressus. It is only one letter difference, but that letter is different. An E instead of an I. Skeptics point out that Cressus is actually a common Roman name, and is probably referring to some person named Cressus. However, although Cressus is a common Roman name, it is not a Jewish name, and there is no reason to believe any Jew has ever been named Cressus. Skeptics will also point out that somebody at Suetonius' academic level would not have made the spelling error of Cressus instead of Christus. However, some have pointed out that the Tacitus passage above, when it talked about Christians, it actually used the word Chrestianus instead of Christianus. So Tacitus may have made the same mistake on the word Christians as Suetonius is on the word Christ. And Tacitus was a much more diligent historian and writer than Suetonius was. So if Tacitus could have made the mistake, then certainly Suetonius could have made the mistake also. Lastly, Crestus means useful one, or Chrestianus would mean useful ones. So it would go against both of these narratives to use the name of a useful person or useful people group. I mean, technically Nero did find use in the Christians in passing the blame for his fire to them, but that's not what either author is trying to invoke here. So Christ or Christus is the more likely answer. And lastly, as a side note, this is cross-referenced in Acts 18:2, where Luke also accounts the banishing of the Jews from Rome. My last source is from the Syrian/Greek author and playwright named Lucian, who lived from about 125 to 180. So this source is most likely written 100 years after Jesus' death. However, Lucian was still born within the 100-year anniversary, so he still lived, and so this still counts. Now, it is unclear of whether this Lucian account is about a playwright for a fictional piece, or rather he's actually recounting genuine history. Personally, it seems to me like a playwright for a satirical play mocking Christianity. Regardless, the passage in question does mention some interesting things about Christians and Jesus. It is called The Passing of Peregrinus, where he depicts a person named Proteus, who goes by the alias Peregrinus. He writes in the 11th paragraph, "It was then that he, Peregrinus, learned the wondrous lore of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine. And how else could it be? In a tryst he made them all look like little children, for he was a prophet, cult leader, head of the synagogues, and everything all by himself. He interpreted and explained some of their books, and even composed many. And they revered him as a god, and made him as a lawgiver, and set him down as protector, next to that other, to be sure, whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine, because he introduced this new cult into the world." So this account is interesting. He claims that this character, Peregrinus, took advantage of Christians by pretending to be a prophet among them, and he gained much wealth and status and even worship from them. He says that they worshipped him alongside this man crucified in Palestine, which is clearly talking about Jesus. It is also interesting to note that he talked about the books of these Christians, which is a pretty early indication that Christians had writings. That was probably the Gospels and letters of Paul. Lucian goes on to criticize Christianity for some length and how Peregrinus extracted from them and took advantage of them, including Peregrinus ending up in prison and getting a whole bunch of financial aid from them. Lucian continues in the middle portion of his 13th paragraph. The poor wretches have convinced themselves, first and foremost, that they are going to be immortal and live out for all time, in consequence of which they despise death and even willingly give themselves into custody, most of them. Furthermore, their first lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another, after they have transgressed once, for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshipping that crucified sophist himself and living under his law. I love how Lucian describes in such spite Jesus and the Christians. He ridicules their brotherly affection towards one another and scoffs at Jesus as this crucified sophist. Some translations say sage, maybe invoking his miracles. But in it, he reveals that Christians are faithful in following Jesus, rejecting the worship of the Greek gods, and even treating each other with such brotherly compassion. Lucian is snarky and sarcastic, and honestly is kind of a fun character. He's basically like Peter, but on the opposite side. But if he is going to mock Christianity for loving each other and treating each other as fellow brothers, and of willingness to put one's own well-being in danger for the unity of the brethren, for rejecting the false gods of the pagans, and for the taking priority in following Jesus over culture, then yeah, I'm on board with that mockery. It wasn't through rejoicing in human sacrifices and throwing unwanted babies out in the streets to die of the elements, or celebrating the gladiatorial games which elevated humanity beyond its barbaric state. It was brotherly love, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who taught the world a new way, which made every man and woman equal, both male and female, slave and free, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, wanted or unwanted, child or elderly. All were made equal in Jesus Christ, according to Paul. It's that teaching that turned the world on its head. So rather we're reading from the New Testament or hostile sources against Christianity in the first century, we can clearly see a message of brotherly love and commandment to treat others as equal, regardless of their rank, race, gender, or age. Those things were not only new to the first century, but gained much mockery, as we have seen in the sources above. But it was those teachings that ended the gladiatorial games, ended paganism, ended human sacrifice, and eventually ended slavery. It was also those teachings that gave women the rank of citizenship equal to men, rather than being a subsect of humanity. This is why many people consider Jesus the single most influential and important figure in all human history. His teachings turned the world upside down in ways that have never been done before or after. Now, as said in the beginning, these are only the non-Christian sources from the first 100 years of Jesus' crucifixion, and all of these have surviving copies to this day from their original form. Much more are the hostile sources that did not survive the passage of time, but fragments are alluded to in Christian sources, or later hostile sources against Christianity, or even Christian sources both inside the New Testament and outside the New Testament. I limited myself to these 5 sources because all these other sources are a big can of worms, fun to get into, but I've not had a whole lot of sleep in the last couple months. So, is there any reason to believe that Christianity was made up over time hundreds of years later without any evidence to any historical bearing? Nope. Many scholars say that Jesus' life, death, and allusion to his resurrection are some of the most verifiable events in ancient human history. And hopefully, I'll be making more videos about some of those other sources. But until then, thanks for watching and keep the faith.